Few people enjoyed the medieval period in Europe more than those noble families and royalty that lived in castles. These symbols of power dominated both their landscapes and society, providing refuge for the ruling classes against war and everyday strife. Their residents did not suffer the grueling conditions of the peasant class, who worried each day about how they would survive. Even to this day, we are fascinated by castles and their daily activities, so let us discover the truth about life inside medieval castles. Contrary to the fantasy visions of modern times, castles were made as fortresses to protect against invasions and not as comfortable residences. These feudal fortresses exercised authority over the lands they ruled with the objectives of maintaining power and control. Today we would look at life in medieval castles as harsh, though compared to everyone else during the feudal period, it was a desired lifestyle with the best comforts of its day. It is important to note that many of the ruling classes which owned castles did not stay there permanently, only occupying them at certain periods during the year. When they did not reside in their castle, they would inhabit other residences. When the family was away from their castle, most of the rooms would be closed off, since they were not in use. When a castle's family was in residence, they would have to contend with a variety of consequences from that building's chief function as a protective fortress. For example, due to their unobstructed views at high elevations, castles received little protection from wind, rain, and similar weather conditions. Therefore, inside the structure, one would encounter cold and damp. Also, due to dampness, there is the constant threat or presence of mold. To aid in the defense of castles, their windows were small in size with wooden shutters, since glass was very expensive at that time. However, this made for dark interiors and dim passageways. As a result, walking inside castles while climbing up and down its numerous stairs could be dangerous. Without the advantages of modern insulation to keep interior spaces warm, fireplaces were essential to combat cold temperatures. Before fireplaces with chimneys came about in the middle of the medieval period, open fires were used, making castles quite smoky. In an attempt to retain warmth, fabric tapestries or wooden panels would cover a castle's stone walls when available. Keeping warm also depended on where you resided inside the castle. Private apartments were located on the upper floors of the safest locations, with fireplaces and comforts. Even the large four-poster beds with canopy and curtains in their bedchambers were designed to keep in heat and the draft out at night. As for the servants, their places of rest were windowless, cold, and cramped interior spaces on the lower level of the castle. They enjoyed no privacy whatsoever. No matter your station in medieval times, there was no such thing as indoor plumbing. Therefore, relieving oneself was not a pleasant or enjoyable occasion. Castle residents would use a long wooden bench with holes as a toilet. These areas were often made so that they overhung a castle wall, with the waste dropping into a moat below or a giant cesspit. As for this large cesspit, usually located at the bottom of the castle, it would accumulate waste until cleaned out by an unfortunate servant called a gone farmer. Their duty would include carrying this waste away to fertilized fields, bury it, or deposit in a community cesspit. Nevertheless, the hideous smells from this cesspit or moat would be present on castle grounds for all to bear. Speaking of human odor, one must remember that many servants, cooks, and other domestic help were required to run a castle. Most if not all of these people had no access to a full bath, with their personal washing habits often limited to cleaning their hands and face. Therefore, lacking the resources for cleansing, their accumulated human odors added to the stench within a castle. As for families that owned castles, they would enjoy a nice hot bath with a portable large wooden tub on a regular basis. Lacking resources for proper hygiene, servants were vulnerable to catching various illnesses and diseases. Unfortunately for the families they took care of, they too could catch these afflictions through spread within the castle. This was yet another possible danger lurking within castles for all residents. Since alcohol was an accepted part of everyday life in medieval times, families that inhabited these fortresses were often in some form of intoxication. Their choice of drinks included wine, ale, mead, and spirits infused with herbs. Water was not a safe option for many in medieval times because they did not have access to clean water, even when it was desired. Residents of castles would look at water with suspicion if there were no clean sources on their estates, or if they suspected wells and other sources of contamination. Being places of protection from warfare, quite a number of these castles contained the infamous dungeon. Here, prisoners, enemies, and offenders of the ruling families would often be subjected to grisly tortures by machines and even hungry animals. Speaking of which, the difficulties of dealing with the constant presence of pests inside castles meant rats and insects were accepted as a fact of life. However, residents still lived in fear of rats, which turns the modern myth of castle life into another medieval nightmare. For the nobility, their day began when they seemed fit, though their servants knew that sunrise began their working day. In the average medieval castle, that would mean between 50 to 150 servants would be performing various tasks by the break of dawn. Of course, servants that were personal attendants to a family member were always on constant call. Within a dimly lit castle, sunlight would aid greatly in a servant's performance of tasks, many of which were done by hand. Castle servants toiled with little free time and for poor wages. Nevertheless, castle life was preferable to being a landless serf or peasant farmer under the feudal system. It has been estimated that approximately 85% of townspeople worked outside of castles, making their daily lives a true struggle for survival. Outside, taking care of livestock, crops, and maintaining the grounds were important duties. Gardeners would look after herbs such as sage, which were used to treat ailments, with varying degrees of effectiveness. With medieval medicine, many of the prescribed cures used herbs. Food played a crucial role in castle life. For example, one female noblewoman was estimated to have spent 40% of her total income on nourishment for castle residents. Yes, lords and ladies of castles regularly hosted celebrations such as feasts, banquets, and holiday gatherings. This required cooks to be constantly preparing food with little time even for their own meals. During these occasions, guests would be seated according to their importance at a long table in the castle's great hall. These great halls were usually the best decorated and warmest part of the castle. In addition to these occasions, a cook's very long day began with preparing morning meals before sunrise to feed both noble families and servants. Another key chore of castle life was the spreading of sweet-smelling grass, reeds, and plants like lavender on the floors. Why, you may ask? They were used to catch any waste that fell to the floor and decrease bad odor. These natural materials would be replaced regularly to contain the level of filth on floors. Lords and ladies were expected to govern their estates and negotiate the constant political intrigue during medieval times. One of their main goals would be to maintain or increase their family's standing within society. Religion also played an important role, so they would regularly attend morning mass at their on-site chapels, which were a common feature of castles. Of course, being a castle, there would be soldiers. More would be present in times of war and strife, though even in peacetime, a dozen or less would be required for basic tasks like opening defensive gates and keeping watch over the grounds of the estate. They would reside in a dormitory or gatehouse if it had a lodging space. When the feudal system came to a close in Europe, the age of castles began to fade. As a result, life for the ruling classes would evolve inside new structures. Castles would have their military features replaced by artillery structures. As for the ruling classes, they would move into opulent places like palaces and country houses, designed for a life of comfort and luxury. Thank you for supporting us at Medieval to Modern. Please be sure to watch another episode shown at the end of this video. Also be sure to like, subscribe, and comment. I wish you good tidings as we remember that sharing knowledge has been a noble deed throughout the ages.